You know, when we look at a map of the modern world or even like a historical map, it is so incredibly easy to see human history in terms of solid, unbroken
Oh,
colors.
absolutely. Like a giant game of Risk.
Right, exactly. You see an empire over here and it's colored red and a major religion over there colored blue, and they have these neat, sharp borders separating them. It's like looking at a stained glass window.
Yeah, the lines are totally binary.
Exactly. You are either inside the border or you're outside of it. But then, you zoom in, you take a magnifying glass to the 7th century Arabian desert, and suddenly that neat stained glass window just shatters. The borders totally vanish.
They do. It's a completely different picture on the ground.
Yeah, we are looking at this historical and religious landscape that is just beautifully messy. It's a vibrant, chaotic melting pot. And yet, out of that specific desert crucible came a movement that evolved into what many consider the very first truly global civilization.
It really is the absolute definition of a historical paradigm shift. I mean, the tendency today is to view the emergence of Islam as this monolith that just appeared out of nowhere, right?
Right, like it just dropped from the sky.
Exactly. Completely fully formed, handed down to desert nomads who were supposedly living in a total vacuum. But if you want to truly understand it, you had to just throw out the map with the solid colors. Islam completely resists simple categorization.
So it wasn't just, isolated tribes inventing something totally alien.
No, not at all. It was the product of Arabs, absolutely, but also of converts from among the Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian communities of the Near East. I mean, it is intimately, inextricably tied to the broader, older tradition of Near Eastern monotheism.
So for you listening right now, if you want a thorough, fluff-free understanding of massive historical topics, you are in the right place. Our mission today is to figure out how a 7th century movement in the Arabian desert became a global empire. We're doing a deep dive into an incredibly dense, fascinating academic source, Jonathan Berkey's chapter on Islam from the New Cambridge History of Islam.
That's a fantastic text, really digs into the roots of it all.
It is. We are extracting all the aha moments about Islamic origins, the development of their law, and some truly mind-bending theology. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because usually when people think of the origins of religion, they picture a blank slate. But Mecca in the early 7th century was anything but blank.
Far from it. It was a bustling hub.
Right. It was polytheistic, yes, but the concept of a creator god, Allah, was actually already present. I mean, Muhammad's own father was named Abdallah, which translates to servant of Allah.
Yeah, that's a detail a lot of people miss.
It's wild. He was born into a world that already had a vague concept of a supreme deity.
Exactly. And we have to look at how deeply integrated the region already was with older monotheistic traditions. We are talking about a landscape where Judaism and Christianity were not foreign, exotic concepts.
They were just part of the fabric.
They were heavily present. You had Jewish communities firmly established in the agricultural oases of Arabia. You had Christian missionaries coming in from Ethiopia, from Iraq specifically, these groups called the Nestorians and Monophysites, as well as representatives from the Byzantine Empire's Orthodox Church.
Wait, hold on. Before we move on, what exactly are Nestorians and Monophysites? Are we talking about different sects of Christianity here?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I feel like understanding how fractured Christianity was at that time might give us a major clue as to what Islam was actually walking into.
That is a crucial point to make. Yes, they were different sects of Christianity, and they were fiercely, and I mean fiercely, divided over the nature of Christ.
Like how divine he was.
Exactly. So the Byzantine Orthodox Church believed Jesus was both fully human and fully divine, two natures in one person. But the Monophysites argued he had only one completely divine nature that just absorbed his human nature.
Okay, got it.
And then the Nestorians argued his divine and human natures were radically separate.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot of very specific theological splitting.
Right, and these weren't just polite, disagreements over tea. They were causing massive political and social unrest. Empires were literally persecuting the losing sects. So the Arabian Peninsula is surrounded by and permeated with empires tearing themselves apart over highly complex, almost mathematically confusing theological definitions of God.
So pre-Islamic Arabs are just sitting there watching all this happen, and they already know the narratives, right? The stories of Abraham, Moses, Jesus. Those concepts were already in the cultural groundwater.
Precisely. The Qur'an actually assumes its original audience already knows these biblical figures.
Really? It doesn't introduce them?
No, it alludes to them without always having to provide the full backstory. Like, it just assumes you know who Noah is. In fact, it references Moses more than any other figure.
That is fascinating.
So, when Muhammad, around the age of 40, retreats to a cave outside Mecca and has this profoundly transforming spiritual encounter where a voice commands him to recite, he doesn't view himself as stepping outside of human history to invent something unprecedented.
Right. He's not trying to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. He views himself as continuing the legacy of those exact prophets, acting as a warner and a messenger to his own people in their own language.
It makes me think of a modern analogy. Early Islam feels less like a sudden alien spaceship landing on Earth and much more like a startup pivoting in an existing market.
I love that analogy. That's exactly what it was.
It makes me wonder, though, was Muhammad originally trying to start a brand new, separate religion with entirely new branding?
Yeah.
Or was he just trying to course correct an existing one?
He was absolutely attempting a course correction. Initially, there was virtually no demand or even a sense among his followers that a new religion was being established.
They didn't even have a name for it yet, did they?
No, the early followers didn't immediately adopt a brand new label. They simply called themselves mu'min, which just means believers. The goal, as Muhammad saw it, was to restore the pure monotheism of Abraham.
Right, the Hanif Muslim.
Yes, exactly. The Qur'an explicitly describes Abraham not as a Jew or a Christian, but as a Hanif Muslim, a pure monotheist who submitted to God. The message wasn't forget everything you know.
It was more like, remember what you forgot.
Beautifully put. The central message of the early Quranic verses portrayed God in transcendent terms that were deeply reminiscent of Jewish and Christian belief. You know, the Lord of the worlds, the Creator who says be, and it is, the merciful judge of the last day. Muhammad saw himself as a prophet, operating firmly within that existing tradition of Near Eastern monotheism. He was calling his people back to a purity that he felt the older traditions had lost or, overcomplicated with things like the Trinity.
But obviously, a pivot of that magnitude is going to totally disrupt the legacy power structures. Muhammad's message of radical monotheism worshiping only this one, invisible God that posed a massive existential threat to the Meccan elite, right? Specifically, his own tribe, the Quraysh.
Oh, massive. And we have to look at the actual mechanics of that threat. It wasn't just that the Quraysh disagreed with him theologically.
Right, they disagreed with him economically.
Exactly. The Quraysh were essentially the aristocrats of the region, and their wealth and power were intimately tied to the polytheistic shrines in Mecca, particularly the Kaaba.
Which was full of idols at the time.
Right. These cults drew worshippers and massive commercial fairs from all over Arabia. The Kaaba housed hundreds of idols representing different tribal deities. It was this protected neutral zone, a massive economic engine for the city.
So if everyone suddenly stops worshiping multiple deities and follows Muhammad's radical monotheism, all those pilgrims just stop coming.
They stop coming, the trade dries up, and the entire economic and political foundation of the Quraysh completely crumbles.
Which forces a physical move that forever changes the DNA of their religion. The Quraysh start heavily persecuting Muhammad and his small band of followers. I mean, they boycott them, they torture the weakest among them, and eventually they plot to assassinate Muhammad himself.
They backed him into a corner.
Yeah, and this forces the hijra, the flight to the oasis city of Yathrib, which becomes Medina. And, it blew my mind to realize that the hijra is so vital, so central to the identity of the faith, that the Islamic calendar doesn't start with Muhammad's birth.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't even start with his first revelation in the cave. It starts with the hijra, the migration.
Because the hijra is the exact moment when the community fundamentally transforms. In Mecca, Muhammad was a preacher with a small, marginalized band of followers. But in Medina, he becomes a statesman.
Right, he was invited there to solve a problem.
Exactly. The people of Medina invited him there specifically to act as an arbiter for their internal, bloody, tribal disputes. And through what is often called the Constitution of Medina, Muhammad essentially creates a totally new kind of social contract.
Okay, let's dig into that constitution, because the name sounds like a modern democratic document, but I'm assuming it wasn't exactly like the Magna Carta or the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
What were the actual mechanics of it?
Well, it was a series of treaties and agreements among the various Arab tribes of Medina, the Jewish tribes living there, and Muhammad's followers who'd fled from Mecca. The genius of the document is that it completely redefined loyalty.
Oh, so?
In ancient Arabia, your ultimate loyalty was to your blood tribe. If your tribe went to war, you went to war, no questions asked. But the Constitution of Medina stated that the umma, this new community of believers, superseded blood ties.
Oh, wow. That's a huge shift.
It was revolutionary. The community would defend itself collectively against outside threats, and Muhammad was recognized as the ultimate arbiter of disputes.
Yeah.
So he became not just a spiritual guide, but the dominant political and military leader. He is leading a confederation. He is leading a state.
And there is an Arabic phrase that perfectly encapsulates this, right? Al-Islam dalla wa din, meaning Islam is both a state and a religion.
Yes, that fusion is fundamental to the character of the emerging Islamic tradition. Legitimate political authority was, from that exact moment, construed in explicitly religious terms. The community, the umma, was seen as the literal instrument of God's will on earth. Statecraft, warfare, diplomacy, taxation, they were no longer secular activities. They were infused with divine purpose.
This is a huge, huge contrast to Christianity because early Christianity grew up in direct opposition to the state.
Right, the Roman Empire.
Exactly. For its first 3 centuries, to be a Christian was to be persecuted by the state. I mean, the quintessential Christian text on this is, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's," unquote. There's a strict separation. But early Islam was Caesar. Early Islam was the state. How does that fundamental difference change the actual religious experience for a believer?
It completely alters the theological trajectory. Think about it. If your religion is formed in opposition to the state, your theology heavily focuses on the next world, on enduring suffering, on a strict separation of the spiritual and the secular. Martyrdom by the state is the highest ideal.
Right, because you have no earthly power.
Exactly. But if your religion is the state, your theology has to deal with administration. It has to regulate a society. It has to deal with armies, with taxes, with criminal justice, with marriage contracts. The material success of the state, its victories in battle, they actually become proof of the truth of the religion.
Oh, I see. Like God favors the community, therefore the community expands and wins battles.
Yes. And we see this rapid evolution happening right there in Medina.
We really do. And it's in Medina where the explicit split from the older monotheisms really starts to solidify. You mentioned Muhammad initially hoping the Jewish tribes in Medina would recognize him as a prophet in the line of Moses, but severe political friction arises.
Yes, the Jewish tribes in Medina had very deep roots, strong alliances, and significant economic power. Muhammad expected them to embrace his message, but they largely rejected his prophetic claims.
Why did they reject it?
Well, from their perspective, the line of prophecy was closed. And it certainly wasn't going to be reopened by an Arab who wasn't part of the traditional covenant. This theological rejection very quickly turned into political subversion. Faced with their reluctance to accept his absolute authority and allegations that some Jewish tribes were secretly conspiring with Muhammad's enemies back in Mecca, who were actively marching on Medina to wipe out the Muslims, by the way, relations just completely broke down.
It became a matter of state security.
Exactly. This led to the siege, expulsion, and in one tragic case, the execution of the men of a major Jewish tribe.
And this political conflict actually mirrors a profound ritual shift, doesn't it? It physically alters how the religion is practiced.
Yes, it does. For the first 18 months after the Hijrah, when Muhammad and his companions prayed, they faced Jerusalem. The Qibla, the direction of prayer, was aligned with Judaism.
Right.
But then, amidst this political fracture in Medina, a new Quranic revelation redirects them. They are told to turn their faces away from Jerusalem and back toward the sacred mosque in Mecca, the Kaaba.
And it wasn't just the direction of prayer, fasting shifted too, right? Originally, the early Muslims fasted alongside the Jewish community on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. But then a revelation shifts the primary fasting period to the month of Ramadan. It's like the religion is taking its roots from the shared Abrahamic soil, but now it's consciously growing its branches in a distinctly different direction.
It's saying, we are no longer just a sect of the older traditions, we are an independent community.
Exactly. It is the definitive process of differentiation.
And the Quran's message regarding Jews and Christians becomes much more complex during this period. It continues to acknowledge the authenticity of their original scriptures. The Torah and the Gospel are still revered as guidance and light, but it increasingly criticizes the communities themselves.
Like criticizing how they practice?
More like criticizing how they preserve the message. The theological argument emerges that the new revelation to Muhammad was necessary precisely because the earlier recipients had corrupted their scriptures or been unfaithful to their covenant. Christianity is critiqued explicitly on theological grounds too.
Going back to the Monophysites and the Nestorians fighting.
Exactly. The doctrine of the Trinity and the Incarnation, all those complex debates over the nature of Christ, the Quran, dismisses all of it as fundamentally incompatible with God's essential radical oneness. The Qur'an explicitly states that God does not beget, nor is he begotten.
So all of this differentiation, this building of a unified religious and political umma, leads to incredible success. Muhammad leads armies, he negotiates treaties, and within 10 years, almost all the Arabs of the peninsula are brought into the umma. Even the Quraysh, his old enemies in Mecca, eventually submit and convert. The stained glass window is coloring the whole map red, so to speak. But then in the year 632 CE, the unthinkable happens. Muhammad dies suddenly and unexpectedly after a brief illness,
Which presents a catastrophic crisis. I mean, what happens to a community that is completely built around the direct, living revelation of God through one single man when that man is suddenly gone?
The history shows it came as a devastating blow that almost collapsed the entire community because, going back to our earlier point, the religion is the state. So when the founder dies, you don't just have a theological crisis, you have a massive political vacuum.
Exactly. The state lost its executive, its chief judge, and its top general all at once. Within hours of his death, literally before he's even buried, the leadership is facing a schism.
And we have to be clear about what the divisive issue actually was. The debate wasn't about who would be the next prophet.
No, not at all. The tradition insists that the book of prophecy closed with Muhammad. He was the seal of the prophets.
Yeah.
God wasn't going to send any more verses of the Quran. The crisis was purely about leadership and administration. Who gets to run the state?
Okay, I want to look at this like a massive, highly successful corporate merger where the charismatic founder, who held all the vision and all the executive power, suddenly dies without a clear, universally agreed upon will. What happens? The board of directors immediately starts fracturing. You get permanent, competing spin-off companies based on entirely different philosophies of management.
That analogy holds up incredibly well. You have different factions immediately vying for control of the company. You have the Ansar, the native Medinans, the helpers who took Muhammad in. They argue that without them, the religion would have died, so one of their own should lead.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Right. Then you have the Muhajirun, the early converts from Mecca, the emigrants from the prestigious Quraysh tribe. They argue they bled first for the faith, and they possessed the aristocratic lineage. Ultimately, a small group of inner circle companions managed to force an agreement on Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest friend and father-in-law.
And he becomes the first caliph.
Yes, which simply means successor or deputy.
But Abu Bakr's succession is far from a smooth transition. I mean, the moment news of Muhammad's death spreads across Arabia, several of the outer Arab tribes decide their contract is just null and void. They essentially say, we pledged our allegiance to Muhammad the man. We did not pledge it to Abu Bakr, and we certainly didn't pledge it to the city of Medina. We're keeping our tax money, our zakat.
Yeah.
We'll still pray, we're still Muslims, but we aren't paying taxes to you.
And Abu Bakr and the leadership in Medina look at this and realize that if they let these tribes secede financially, the entire state will just dissolve. They reject the tribe's argument completely. They launch what become known as the Ridda Wars, or the Wars of Apostasy.
Wait, apostasy. But the tribes just said they wanted to keep their tax money. They didn't say they stopped believing in God. How does a tax dispute turn into a charge of leaving the religion?
Because of that core fusion we discussed. Al-Islam Dawla Wadin. Religion and state are one. To Abu Bakr, the zakat wasn't just a municipal tax. It was a religious obligation owed to God and collected by God's representative state. By withholding the tax, they were rebelling against the state, and by rebelling against the state, they were rebelling against God.
So to him, it's all the same thing.
Exactly. Abu Bakr wages ruthless military campaigns against these tribes, and he wins. This victory is crucial because it cements two massive precedents that shape all of Islamic history. First, it forcefully confirms the link between Islam and the Arabs, establishing the political expectation that all Arabs must be part of the Muslim state.
Right.
And second, it embeds the principle into Islamic law that political rebellion against the legitimate community is indistinguishable from apostasy. Leaving the faith is politically and religiously unacceptable.
So the state survives by force of arms. But the debate over the management philosophy, who gets to be the caliph and what power they actually hold, that only intensifies as the empire expands. And, my goodness, it expands with terrifying speed. Within a single century, Muslim Arab armies burst out of the peninsula, conquer the Sassanid Persian Empire, strip the Byzantine Empire of its richest provinces, and sweep across North Africa and much of Southwest Asia.
This is unprecedented.
The wealth pouring into Medina is just unfathomable. The elite families establish dynastic rule. First, you get the Umayyads ruling from Damascus, then the Abbasids ruling from Baghdad. But because the religion is the state, resisting the government's corruption or its dynastic structure isn't just a political argument. It is fundamentally a theological argument.
Exactly.
Which leads to the birth of the major sects.
In this environment, when you argue about politics, you are necessarily arguing about religion. The Umayyads and later the Abbasids essentially turned the caliphate into a monarchy. They were passing absolute power from father to son, surrounded by immense wealth and courtly intrigue. And there was fierce, violent resistance to this from various factions who believed the community had totally lost its way. The most extreme of these were the Kharijites.
Right, the Kharijites. Let's talk about them because they seem like the absolute radical purists of early Islam.
They absolutely were. The Kharijites believed that bloodline, tribal affiliation, or dynastic claims meant absolutely nothing. To them, the leader of the community should simply be the most pious, morally upright Muslim available, even if he was, in their famous phrase, an Abyssinian slave.
Which was a radical egalitarian idea at the time.
Very radical. But their Puritanism had a really dark side. They believed that committing a grave sin or ruling unjustly completely nullified a person's status as a Muslim. Therefore, if a ruler became impious, the Kharijites believed it was a binding religious duty to declare him an apostate and assassinate him. They were the architects of constant rebellion.
And they actually did assassinate the fourth caliph, Ali, which brings us to the much larger movement of opposition, the faction that forms around Ali himself, the Shia.
Yes, the Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali. Ali was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, having married Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. From the very beginning, even back at that corporate merger meeting after Muhammad's death, a faction believed Ali was the only rightful successor.
Because of its ties to the Prophet?
Exactly. The Shia believed that legitimate rule belonged exclusively to the bloodline of Ali and Fatima. But it wasn't just about aristocratic lineage. It evolved into a profound theological doctrine over time. They believed these leaders, the imams, possessed a divine authoritative knowledge of God's will. They possessed a divine light passed down from the Prophet.
So it's not just politics for them either.
Right. For the Shia, it wasn't just about holding executive political power. The imam was the absolute, infallible arbiter of all things religious and political.
Okay, so if you have the Kharijites on one hand saying the leader must be perfectly pious or we literally kill him, and the Shia on the other hand saying the leader must be the infallible blood descendant of Ali, where does the vast majority, the people who become the Sunnis, fit into this picture? You mentioned earlier they embraced political quietism. But you're telling me the majority of Muslims just looked at corrupt dynastic kings passing the caliphate to their sons, shrugged, and said, well, at least we aren't at war. That sounds incredibly passive for a religion that just conquered half the known world. How did they justify that theologically?
It does sound passive to modern ears, yeah. But we really have to understand the sheer trauma of the early civil wars, the fitnas. We're talking about decades of Muslims slaughtering other Muslims over who should lead. The Sunni response was largely forged out of deep, deep anxiety over the total collapse of the umma.
They just wanted the bleeding to stop.
Exactly. They looked at the fracturing, the violence, the assassinations of early caliphs, and they concluded that civil war was actually a worse sin than an unjust ruler. Their theological justification was pragmatism in the service of unity. They tacitly accepted the status quo, even if that meant accepting flawed, worldly dynastic rulers like the Umayyads or Abbasids, as long as the ruler vaguely maintained Islamic law and defended the borders. Their primary goal was maintaining the physical and social unity of the community.
So they essentially separate the ideal from the real. But the tension didn't stop at who the caliph was. It spilled over into what the caliph could actually do. I mean, in the early days, the caliph seemed to have a lot of religious authority. Caliph Umar sets punishments for adultery. Caliph Uthman forcefully compiles the official, standardized version of the Qur'an and literally burns all the variants. The Umayyads even called themselves the Caliphate Allah, the Viceroy of God, rather than the deputy of the Prophet. They saw themselves as divinely appointed.
They absolutely did.
But then, under the Abbasid dynasty, there's this massive power struggle between the state and a newly emerging class of scholars, the Ulama.
This is one of the most critical turning points in all of Islamic history. The Ulama were the religious scholars, men who had devoted their lives to memorizing the Qur'an and the sayings of the Prophet. They saw themselves, not the caliphs sitting in their lavish palaces in Baghdad, as the true defenders and inheritors of Muhammad's memory. As the Abbasid caliphs tried to aggressively assert their authority over religious doctrine, they collided with the Ulama.
And the ultimate test of this collision was an episode known as the Mina, right? Which translates roughly as an inquisition.
Yes, the Mina. It was initiated by the incredibly powerful Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun in the 9th century.
Okay, let's dive deep into the Mina. The caliph decides to institute a religious purity test. He tries to force the scholars, the judges, and the state officials to publicly agree to a highly specific, very controversial theological doctrine. The doctrine that the Qur'an was created in time, rather than being uncreated and co-eternal with God. Now, to a modern listener, why on earth would the emperor of half the world care about such a highly specific, abstract philosophical point?
Because it wasn't just philosophy. It was about absolute power.
How so?
Think about it. If the Quran is uncreated and co-eternal with God, it is an immutable, untouchable text. And who are the masters of that text?
It's scholars of the Ulama.
Exactly. But if the Quran was created by God in a specific moment in time, it is an artifact. And as a created artifact, it requires a divinely guided living intellect to interpret it and apply it to new situations. And who is that divinely guided living intellect? The Caliph al-Mamun believed it was him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By forcing the scholars to say the Quran was created, he was actually forcing them to hand ultimate religious authority over to the caliphate.
That is a brilliant political maneuver masked as a theological debate. But the scholars see right through it, don't they?
They do. Most of the ulama fundamentally refused to agree. They were imprisoned, beaten, and tortured. The most famous resistor was Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He endured severe beatings but absolutely refused to concede that the Quran was created. And he became a populist hero in Baghdad because of it.
Because the optics are terrible for the state.
Exactly. The state was torturing a pious, humble scholar. Eventually, after several caliphs maintained this inquisition, the Abbasid state realized it was losing immense public legitimacy. They backed down.
And the scholars won. The state blinked. This essentially finalizes a uniquely Islamic separation of powers. I mean, it's not the Western post-Enlightenment separation of church and state, because the state is still inherently religious. The caliph still collects religious taxes, wages holy war, and builds mosques. But the caliph forever loses the power to dictate what the dogmas of that religion actually are. The caliph has executive, worldly power, but the ulama control the definition of the religion.
Which leaves the ulama with a monumental, terrifying task.
Because now they have to actually do the job.
Exactly. If they're the ones in charge of defining the religion and the law, they actually have to figure out what God's law is for an empire that now stretches from the Atlantic Ocean in Spain to the Indus River in India. I mean, how do you govern commerce, marriage, crime, diet, and inheritance in such a diverse, unimaginably complex civilization?
Which brings us to the birth of the Islamic sciences. The lawyers have to get to work. And to figure out the law, the shari'a, they couldn't just rely on the Qur'an. Because the Qur'an is actually not a legal code. It's a series of revelations, exhortations, warnings, and stories. The amount of actual hard legislation in it is quite limited, mostly dealing with inheritance, some family law, and a few punishments. It doesn't tell you how to conduct a complex trade contract in Baghdad. So where do they turn?
They turn to the Prophet himself, or rather the memory of him. They turn to the Hadith, the recorded sayings, deeds, and even just tacit approvals of Muhammad and his early companions. The concept of the Sunnah, or the normative model practice of the Prophet, became so incredibly powerful that in some legal contexts, the Hadith actually eclipsed the Qur'an as a source of legal guidance.
Wait, eclipse the Qur'an? That sounds almost heretical. Give me an example of how a saying of the Prophet could override the literal word of God.
A classic example involves criminal law. So the Qur'an explicitly mandates a punishment of 100 lashes for the crime of adultery. It's right there in the text. But the scholars uncovered oral traditions, Hadith, containing stories where Muhammad and his companions approved of the punishment of stoning to death for married adulterers. And the Muslim jurists, when formalizing the law, went with the Hadith.
They ignored the 100 lashes.
Stoning became the standard legal punishment in the law books, despite the Quranic verse. The logic was that the Prophet was divinely inspired in his actions, so his actions could clarify, restrict, or even supersede the general rulings of the Quran. There's even a famous quote from a later scholar that says, "The Sunnah is the judge of the Quran, not the Quran of the Sunnah."
But relying on oral history is incredibly dangerous. Because the Hadith were so legally and politically powerful, they became a massive vulnerability. I mean, if you were a politician who wanted to justify a new tax, or a jurist who wanted to ban a new behavior, or a theologian pushing a specific doctrine, all you had to do was invent a quote, say, "the Prophet said," and spread it. And because these were passed down orally across a massive geographic area, fabrications must have run absolutely rampant.
It was an epidemic of forgery. Hundreds of thousands of fabricated sayings were circulating in the empire.
Yeah.
So the scholars faced an existential crisis for their legal system. How do you build the divine legal system on a foundation of counterfeit quotes?
Right, you can't.
So you invent a rigorous, almost scientific system of textual authentication. Scholars like al-Bukhari and Muslim dedicated their entire lives to sifting through these hundreds of thousands of hadith.
How did they actually do it? Did they analyze the text itself to see if it sounded like something Muhammad would say?
Sometimes they looked at the text, yes, but their primary focus was actually on the isnad, the chain of transmission. The isnad is the list of names attached to every single hadith. Like, I heard from person A, who heard from person B, who heard from person C, who heard from the prophet.
Okay.
The scholars developed a massive biographical science to investigate every single name in these chains. They compiled massive biographical dictionaries. Who was person A? Were they known to be a liar? Did they have a good memory? Did person B and person C live in the same city at the same time? Could they have actually met?
It's like detective work.
It literally is. If person B died before person C was born, the chain is broken and the hadith is thrown out, no matter how good the actual quote sounds. They ruthlessly discarded tens of thousands of sayings and codified only the ones with rock-solid, unbroken chains of reliable narrators into major canonical collections.
And with that stabilized foundation of authenticated hadith, the jurists, the fuqaha, could actually build the scaffolding of the shari'a Islamic law. Over time, this massive intellectual effort crystallized into distinct schools of legal thought, known as madhabs. In the Sunni world, out of many early schools, 4 survived and became standard into the classical period: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali schools. The Shia developed their own parallel legal systems, notably the Jafari school.
What's truly fascinating is the methodology they used to build the law. The premier legal theorist, a scholar named al-Shafi'i, helped systematize jurisprudence based on 4 primary foundations or roots. First, the Qur'an, the literal word of God. Second, the Sunnah, derived from those authenticated hadith. But those 2 texts are finite, right?
Yeah, you only have so many verses and sayings.
Exactly. And the situations of human life are infinite, so they needed tools to expand the law to cover new things. The third root is qiyas, or human reason through strict analogy.
Let's talk about qiyas, analogies, because understanding this really unlocks how Islamic law actually breathes. Like, the Qur'an explicitly forbids drinking wine derived from grapes. But the Qur'an was written in 7th century Arabia. It doesn't say a single word about date palm wine or beer or modern things like vodka. So does that mean a Muslim in 9th century Baghdad could drink beer because it's technically a loophole?
Nope.
Right? No. The scholars use strict analogy. They ask, why is wine forbidden? What is the effective cause, or the illa? The cause is that it intoxicates and clouds the mind. Beer also intoxicates. Therefore, by direct analogy, beer shares the prohibition of wine.
Exactly. It's a tightly controlled use of human reason. But the fourth foundation is perhaps the most profound: ijma, or consensus. There is a famous hadith where the prophet says, "My community will never agree upon an error." This foundation introduces a collective human element to divine law. While Islamic law is viewed as God's law, practically speaking, if the recognized scholars across the empire reach a consensus on a ruling, that consensus becomes infallible law. Islamic law is ultimately what the consensus of the jurists says it is.
Okay, but this raises a huge practical question for me. The entire legal system is based on finding precedents in the 7th century, imitating the prophet. There is a very strong concept of bid'ah, which translates to innovation. There is a dictum attributed to Muhammad that says, every new thing is an innovation, and every innovation is an error, and every error leads to hell. If the entire legal system is obsessed with imitating the past and any innovation is a fast track to hell, what does this mean for a merchant trying to run a business in 10th century Cairo? Does this mean Islamic law was just totally frozen? Did they just stop inventing new ways of doing things?
I mean, it's easy to see why one might assume that, especially later when the doctrine of taqlid, which demanded strict imitation of past scholars, became more prominent. But the reality on the ground was that the law was incredibly flexible, pragmatic, and responsive to the needs of society.
How so?
Legal systems have to function in the real world, or people simply abandon them. Many jurists recognize that not all bid'ah was bad. They actually categorized innovations. Some were forbidden, yes, but others were considered permissible, praiseworthy, or even required if they served the public good and didn't directly contradict the core texts.
So how did they actually adapt the law without explicitly breaking the rules?
They used a few brilliant mechanisms. One was the fatwa. We hear that word a lot today, often in a very negative context. But historically, a fatwa is simply a non-binding legal opinion issued by a qualified scholar, a mufti, in response to a specific novel question from a believer.
Like an advice column.
Basically. Say a merchant comes and asks, is this new type of promissory note acceptable? The mufti investigates and issues a fatwa. Because it wasn't a binding court ruling, different scholars could issue different fatwas based on their interpretation. This created an incredibly dynamic legal environment with plenty of room for disagreement, debate, and organic evolution.
And they also used what the jurists called hayal, which translates to legal tricks or workarounds, particularly in commercial law. This is fascinating to me because the Qur'an strictly forbids riba, which is generally understood as the charging of interest on loans.
Right.
But if you have a massive cosmopolitan empire trading from Spain across the Mediterranean all the way to India and China, you literally cannot have a functioning, complex, mercantile economy without credit. And credit requires interest. So how do you obey God without completely collapsing the economy?
You find a workaround. The jurists, who were deeply integrated into the merchant class themselves, developed highly complex, incredibly clever business partnerships and contracts that allowed Muslims to conform to the letter of the Quranic law, while bypassing the spirit of the prohibition to accommodate the absolute necessity of interest.
Can you give an example of how a hayal actually worked in practice, like mechanically?
Sure. A common one was the double sale, or bay'alina. Let's say you need a loan of 100 gold coins, and I want to charge you 10% interest.
Okay, simple enough.
But I can't just hand you 100 coins and ask for 110 back. That's forbidden riba. So instead, I take an object, say a piece of cloth, and I sell it to you for 110 coins to be paid back 1 year from now. We write a contract. You now own the cloth, and you owe me 110 coins in a year.
Right.
Immediately, in a second, completely separate contract, I buy that exact same piece of cloth back from you right now for 100 coins in cash.
Oh, what?
You walk away with the 100 coins in cash you needed today. A year later, you owe me 110 coins. Technically, on paper, we just engaged in two completely legal, permissible sales of a commodity. But practically, I just loaned you money with interest.
That is essentially legal money laundering, sanctioned by the religious scholars. It shows a remarkable adaptability. The ulama were deeply concerned with aligning God's law with the earth, the established custom of the marketplace. They were the architects of the faith, yes, but they realized they were building a house meant to be lived in, not a rigid museum piece.
Precisely. But while the lawyers were down in the marketplace debating the precise mechanics of commercial contracts and, ritual washing, there was an entirely different, arguably much more intense battle happening over the mind and soul of the believer. The theologians and the mystics weren't interested in contracts. They were debating the very nature of God himself.
Which brings us to theology, or kalam. And what's fascinating here is that initially, Islam didn't really seem to need a complex philosophical theology. If you look at early Christianity, doctrines like the Trinity or the two natures of Christ required massive, elaborate theological frameworks and councils just to articulate. But the core of early Islam was breathtakingly simple. The Shahada, the fundamental statement of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. It's austere, it's direct.
It is direct, but as the Arab armies conquered the Byzantine and Sassanid territories, Muslim scholars suddenly found themselves living in cities like Damascus and Alexandria. They were living alongside highly sophisticated Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian theologians who had been arguing philosophy using Greek logic for centuries.
They bumped into Aristotle and Plato.
Exactly. They start having these spirited interfaith debates. The Christians would ask the Muslims complex, philosophical questions about the nature of God's word or free will. And the Muslims realized, wait, if the Christians have these elaborate, logically airtight theological arguments, we need to develop our own tools to defend our faith. And so kalam, the Islamic science of speech or dialectical theology, is born.
And once they learned Greek logic, they didn't just use it against the Christians, they turned it inward. They started tackling massive, seemingly unsolvable philosophical questions raised by the Qur'an itself. For example, if God is absolutely all-powerful and all-knowing and knows everything that will ever happen, do humans actually have free will?
A classic paradox.
Right. Or are our actions predetermined? If we don't have free will, how is it just for God to punish us and how? And most contentiously, how do you understand the physical descriptions of God in the Qur'an?
This is where the intellectual war truly breaks out. Because the Qur'an uses human language to describe the divine. It talks about God having sight or hands or sitting upon a throne. This sparked a massive crisis. On one side, you have the rationalists, the Mu'tazila.
Wow.
They heavily utilized Greek philosophy and logic. Their core doctrine was Tawhid, the absolute, pure, indivisible unity of God.
Okay, so how did they handle the hands thing?
They argued that if you say God literally has a hand or literally sits on a physical throne, you are placing God in physical space. You're giving him a body. And if he has body, he is limited and made of parts, which compromises his absolute singular oneness. Therefore, the Mu'tazila argued, these descriptions in the Qur'an must be interpreted purely as metaphors. Hand just means power.
The Mu'tazila saw themselves as the ultimate defenders of God's pure majesty. But by using Greek logic to interpret the literal word of God, they deeply alarmed the traditionalists. The traditionalists, led by figures like our old friend Ahmad ibn Hanbal from the Inquisition, they completely rejected the use of human reason in matters of divine faith. Their stance was, human logic is flawed. The Qur'an is perfect. If the Qur'an says God sits on a throne, then God sits on a throne. To call it a metaphor is to rewrite God's word.
But the rationalists would counter. So you worship a God with a physical body who sits on a chair.
Right, which sounds like idolatry to them.
Exactly. And the Hanbali traditionalists would reply with a famous doctrine, Bila Kaif, without asking how. We believe he sits on a throne, but we do not ask how he does it because his sitting is not like human sitting. We accept the text without applying human logic to the divine reality.
I can just imagine the shouting matches in the mosques of 9th century Baghdad over this. The rationalists yelling, "You're being anthropomorphic idolaters," and the traditionalists yelling back, "You're arrogant philosophers questioning the literal word of God." It seems like an unbridgeable divide. How did the religion survive this internal tearing?
Ultimately, a brilliant synthesis emerges through a 10th century scholar named al-Ash'ari. He actually started out as a prominent Mu'tazilite rationalist, but he had a crisis of faith, famously defected to the traditionalist camp, and fundamentally changed Islamic theology. He essentially took the tools of the rationalist, the rigorous dialectical logic of Kalam, and used them to logically defend the traditionalist views.
Wait, how do you logically defend a position that says stop using logic? How did Ash'ari actually do that?
By developing highly complex philosophical models to support traditional doctrines. For example, to defend the absolute power of God without falling into the trap of saying God physically causes evil, the Ash'aris developed a theory of atomism and occasionalism.
Okay, break that down for me.
They argued that God literally destroys and recreates the entire universe, every single atom of it, at every single sequential moment in time.
Every moment.
Every single moment. There is no natural cause and effect. Fire doesn't burn cotton because fire has the inherent nature to burn. Fire burns cotton because God habitually chooses to create the accident of burning in the cotton at the exact moment it touches the fire.
That is mind-bending, the matrix level of philosophical theory.
It is, and regarding free will, al-Ash'ari developed the theory of cause, or acquisition. God creates every single action, good or bad, but the human being acquires the action at the moment it happens, thus making the human morally responsible for an action ultimately created by God. It was a brilliant, if notoriously difficult to understand, middle ground. It allowed a sophisticated theology to survive within mainstream Sunni Islam without compromising the supremacy of God's power.
But let's take a step back here. We're talking about atomism and the continuous recreation of the universe. For the vast majority of regular people, these elite theological debates in Baghdad meant absolutely nothing. I mean, the average farmer in Egypt or merchant in Spain wasn't losing sleep over the theory of Qasd. For the average person, Islam was experienced through the physical rhythm of worship.
Absolutely. The lived experience of the religion was anchored in practice. The 5 daily prayers, the salat, the physical act of prostration, kneeling and pressing the forehead to the ground, submitting the body and soul to God alongside your neighbors.
That communal aspect is huge.
It is. And crucially, the Friday congregational gathering and the khutbah, the sermon, which is interesting because the Friday sermon wasn't just a spiritual homily. It was a highly charged political event. The preacher would end the sermon by invoking a blessing on the reigning caliph or local ruler. If a preacher omitted the ruler's name, it wasn't an oversight. It was literally considered a public declaration of rebellion against the state.
But for some believers, the communal ritual of the 5 daily prayers, the dry legalism of the scholars, and the abstract philosophy of the theologians just wasn't enough. They felt the religion had become too focused on rules and empire. They wanted a direct, personal, visceral experience of the divine. This impulse is the root of Sufism.
Yes, the mystics of Islam. It started as pure asceticism, really, a rejection of the massive wealth and luxury of the Umayyad and Abbasid empires. Pious individuals would wear rough wool suf in Arabic, which is where the name Sufi likely comes from, and they devote themselves to constant prayer and fasting. One of those famous early figures was a woman, Rabia Basra, in the 8th century.
She popularized the concept of divine love, right?
She did. She argued that she didn't want to worship God out of a mercenary fear of hell or a greedy desire for the rewards of paradise. She wanted to worship God purely for an absolute, exclusive love of God for his own sake.
But over time, this ascetic movement evolves into radical mysticism. It's no longer just about living simply, it's about altering human consciousness. They develop esoteric practices, chanting, intense meditation, seeking ways to strip away the ego to achieve the annihilation of the self, the fana, in the overwhelming presence of the divine reality.
And this terrifies the ulama. I mean, the legal scholars have spent centuries painstakingly building this massive, intricate scaffolding of laws, rituals, and boundaries to regulate the community, maintain social order, and define exactly what Islam is. And suddenly you have mystics who claim to have a direct internal hotline to God, essentially bypassing the entire structure. The mystical path is inherently individualistic and subjective. It doesn't need the lawyer, the judge, or the textbook.
I want you to imagine being a rigid 10th century Islamic lawyer. You've memorized thousands of hadith. You know every microscopic nuance of contract law. You know the exact angle your arm should be at during prayer. You enforce the rules. And then you watch a Sufi mystic completely ignore the rule book, perhaps even neglecting formal prayers, because they claim they are already in a state of ecstatic union with God. The tension between the law and the spirit is palpable, and it violently boils over. The famous Persian mystic al-Hallaj went so far into this ecstatic, self-annihilated state that he wandered the streets and publicly declared, "I am the truth, ana al-haq." And since the truth is one of the names of God in Islam, the scholars heard a man claiming to be God.
And he was arrested, tortured, and brutally executed for heresy in Baghdad. His outburst was theologically unacceptable to the ulama, but more than that, his approach threatened the entire social fabric. If a direct personal experience of God can override the established law, the whole system of the shari'a could collapse into anarchy.
They couldn't let that happen.
No, but the scholars realized they couldn't just execute every Sufi either. The movement was way too popular. Fortunately for the tradition, later scholars, most notably the brilliant intellectual giant al-Ghazali in the 11th century, managed to bridge this gap. Al-Ghazali was a master of law and theology who suffered a nervous breakdown because he felt his religion had become intellectually hollow. He turned to Sufism and then wrote massive works integrating Sufi mysticism into mainstream Sunni practice.
How did he merge them?
He argued that the law was the necessary outward shell, but Sufi mysticism was the inner beating heart. Mystical practice could actually cultivate a more sincere, transformative piety that complemented rather than destroyed the law.
So by the 10th and 11th centuries, we have this incredible, rich, complex civilization. They have navigated the death of their founder, built a global empire, survived civil wars, developed a sophisticated legal system that touches every aspect of life, argued the finer points of atomic theology, and managed to integrate profound mysticism without breaking the law. It's a delicate, beautiful equilibrium. But just as they achieve this balance, the outside world violently crashes in. The stained glass window isn't just shattering, it's being ground into dust. The civilization faces existential threats that force a total circling of the wagons.
Up until this point, the debates we've discussed were largely internal to the Islamic world. But now, Islam faces geopolitical threats that threaten to wipe it off the map entirely. The political fragmentation of the Abbasid Empire led to what is sometimes called the Shia century.
Right, when the Sunnis lost a lot of ground.
Exactly. The central Sunni caliphate lost its power, and various Shia empires rose up like the Fatimids, who established an Ismaili Shia caliphate in Egypt and founded Cairo, and the Buyids, a Twelver Shia dynasty that actually conquered Baghdad and reduced the Sunni caliph to a mere puppet. This internal fracture deeply weakened the Sunni establishment, but this internal shift was soon overshadowed by massive new arrivals from the east.
The Turks.
Yeah.
Nomadic, warlike tribes migrating out of the Central Asian steppes, entering the Islamic world initially as imported slave soldiers, the Mamluks, and eventually realizing they held all the military power, taking over themselves as sultans. You get the Seljuks, later the Mamluk Sultan Egypt, and eventually the Ottomans. These Turkish regimes were fiercely Sunni, and they actually rescued the Sunni Caliphate from the Shia and expanded the empire into Anatolia, the Balkans, and India. But even the formidable Turkish cavalry couldn't stop the tidal wave of trauma that was about to hit the Islamic heartlands from both the West and the East simultaneously.
We are talking about the great defining traumas of the medieval Islamic world. First, from the West. In 1097, the first Crusaders arrive in Syria from Europe. The Muslim world was entirely unprepared for this religiously fueled, heavily armored invasion. The brutality of the Crusader conquests, particularly the horrific, bloody sacking of Jerusalem in 1099, where tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were slaughtered in the streets, left the Muslim world bewildered and horrified.
And that wasn't the only threat from the West.
No. At the same time, on the other end of the Mediterranean, the Christian Reconquista is steadily, violently pushing Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, where they had spent centuries building an incredibly advanced cosmopolitan society.
They are losing their holy cities and their European strongholds, but the Crusades pale in comparison to the ultimate nightmare scenario, the 13th century, the Mongol invasion.
The sheer scale of it is hard to comprehend.
Genghis Khan and his successors unleash a storm of destruction from the east that the world had never seen. In 1258, pagan Mongol armies under Hulagu Khan reach Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 5 centuries. They sack the city, they slaughter the inhabitants, they execute the caliph by rolling him in a carpet and having horses trample him to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth.
The destruction of knowledge was staggering, too.
Yeah, the famous libraries of Baghdad are destroyed. It was said the Tigris River ran black with the ink of scholars' books and then red with their blood. The psychological toll of this event on the Muslim consciousness is almost impossible to overstate. The umma, the community that was supposed to be the favored instrument of God's will on earth, the community that had never known true existential defeat, was being annihilated by pagans.
It provoked a massive theological crisis. Had God abandoned the Muslims? And the societal response to a trauma of that magnitude facing existential annihilation is rarely to become more open, tolerant, and experimental.
Right. You don't open up when you're under attack.
The response is a defensive contraction, a xenophobic circling of the wagons. We see a harsh crackdown on non-Muslim minorities, the dhimmis. In times of wealth and expansion, relations were relatively tolerant. But under threat, minorities were viewed with suspicion. In the Islamic West, the Almohad dynasty became so religiously militant and intolerant that famous Jewish scholars, like the philosopher Maimonides, were forced to flee Spain for their lives and seek refuge in Egypt.
And the very concept of jihad undergoes a major theological shift here, doesn't it? For centuries, the jurists had categorized military jihad largely as a communal duty, something the state handled on the frontiers to slowly expand the borders. It wasn't the responsibility of the average farmer. But in the face of the Crusaders and the Mongols, when the heartlands were being invaded, prominent scholars issued fatwas declaring that jihad had become an individual responsibility, a fard al-tain incumbent on every single capable Muslim, just like prayer or fasting. The very survival of the faith was at stake.
The Mamluks of Egypt eventually managed to defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, stopping their advance and essentially saving Islam from total destruction. But the trauma fundamentally changed the civilization. This subsequent period is often called the Sunni revival by historians, but as the source material astutely points out, it was less of a creative revival and more of a consolidation. To survive the chaos, the Ulama realized they had to prioritize absolute homogeneity. They needed to lock down the tradition to protect it from the chaos outside.
They built walls around the intellect. This is when the opposition to innovation, bid'ah, becomes intensely reinvigorated. The parameters of permitted thought are sharply circumscribed. The scholars declared that the gates of ijtihad, the process of independent reasoning to formulate new laws, were effectively closed.
They felt the foundational work was already done.
Right. The doctrine of taqlid, demanding strict, unquestioning imitation of the past legal judgments of the 4 established schools, becomes dominant. They decided the founding fathers had figured it all out. Modern scholars just needed to memorize and apply their rulings. And they start building massive physical institutions to enforce this standardization.
Yes, the state and the scholars collaborate to build the madrasas. These weren't just general universities where you could study whatever you wanted. They were dedicated law schools, heavily endowed by state officials to teach Islamic jurisprudence strictly according to the 4 surviving Sunni schools. And alongside them, they built the khanqahs, the Sufi convents, which routinized and supervised the mystical life, bringing the potentially dangerous freewheeling mystics under the watchful eye of the establishment.
It's all about control.
Completely. These physical institutions created a paid, professional class of scholars and clerics whose explicit job was to protect, standardize, and pass down the faith exactly as it was defined by the Orthodox consensus.
They basically built an intellectual, legal, and theological fortress to survive the end of the world. And to their credit, it worked. The tradition survived the Mongols, it survived the Crusaders, and it preserved the religion intact. Which brings us to the end of this massive, incredible journey. We have gone from a single man in a desert cave receiving a terrifying command to recite to the fleeing of a persecuted minority, to the oasis of Medina, to the explosive, world-altering growth of a global political empire. We've seen the corporate spin-offs of the sects, the incredibly intricate, meticulously authenticated architecture of Islamic law and the Hadith, the intense, reality-bending philosophical battles over the nature of God, the passionate mystical yearning of the Sufis, and finally the building of walls to survive the catastrophic violence of the 13th century.
It is a testament to the immense resilience, intellectual depth, and adaptability of the tradition, and it is absolutely crucial context for today. Whenever you look at the modern Middle East, whenever you see debates on the news about the application of Islamic law or the geopolitical divide between Sunni and Shia states, or the constant tension between governments and religious authorities, you are not looking at modern, isolated phenomena. You are looking directly at the echoes of these exact 7th to 13th century debates over statehood, succession, and divine authority.
It all traces back to the Crucible. The DNA was set centuries ago. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've unpacked today about how the system adapts to stress.
Yes. This history raises a profound question for the modern era. We saw how the extreme, violent trauma of the Crusaders and the Mongols is what ultimately caused classical Islam to circle the wagons. It forced the scholars to prioritize strict legal consensus, to elevate taqlid and imitation over independent reasoning, and to close the doors to theological innovation simply as a defense mechanism to survive a chaotic, hostile world.
So, how might the chaotic, borderless information age of the 21st century impact that system today? In an era of the internet where information, competing ideologies, and global debates cannot be kept out by fortress walls, will that traditional system be forced to double down on its defensive posture even harder to maintain its boundaries? Or will the sheer pressure of modernity finally force it to reopen the gates of independent reasoning and spark a new era of ijtihad?
It's a fascinating open question. Because as we said at the very beginning, when you look at history as a stained glass window from a distance, it seems fixed, rigid, and permanent. But when you zoom in, the glass shatters.
History isn't a fixed map. It's a living, breathing conversation that is still happening right now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the map, keep looking past the borders, and we'll catch you next time.